Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name's Dr Ron Ehrlich. Now, I got my first mobile phone, it would have been over 20 years ago, and actually I was so thrilled by it all. The fact that you could make phone calls from anywhere was incredible. And then as the whole thing evolved into smartphones 10 or so years ago, I really wasn't asking questions like my next guest, Lyn McLean. Lyn started asking questions about the effect of wireless radiation on our health in 1996, over 20 years ago. So, when you think about it, our bodies, in fact, every atom in the universe is both energy and matter. So every cell functions on tiny little currents, and every nerve functions on tiny little currents. And to imagine that wireless radiation doesn't affect us in some way is kind of naive at the very best. And when you think back to some of the other health issues, or even currently or in the past, what about cigarettes? We knew cigarettes were bad, or the science was in on cigarettes in the 1930s and 40s, but it was 2009 when the American FDA finally deemed it to be an addictive substance. Asbestos, it took about 30 years for that to happen, and the lead time on a lot of these diseases is a really long time. Sugar, cover up, let's blame fats. Climate change, despite the fact that 3,000 scientists say climate change is a problem, the coal industry saying, when the science isn't in on it, is ridiculous. So the same goes here for wireless radiation. And Lyn has written a fabulous book called Wireless Wise Families, What Every Parent Needs to Know About Wireless Technology. And I've just kind of appropriated that name for this episode and just said Wireless Wise People, because this is something that I think every person, whether you're a parent or not, needs to know about wireless radiation. So I hope you enjoy this chat that I had with Lyn McLean. Welcome to the show, Lyn.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's lovely to be here.
Lyn, tell me how you got into this area of wireless radiation.
Well, this is a very long story, and I often wonder why and how I got into it myself. There are a whole lot of answers to that, and one is that I was really, really interested in the science and read some fascinating research that was done back in the 60s by a scientist called Robert Becker, and I could go on at length about that, but I won't. And I think one of the other reasons is that I'm a mum, and it matters to me a great deal about what my own kids are being exposed to, and by default what other people's kids are being exposed to. So it's become very important to try and get the message out so that other mums understand what these devices are doing and how they're affecting people, and they can then make informed choices for their families too. And the third reason, Ron, is that back in the day, and I started getting involved in this in 1996, there was really no help for people in Australia about this issue, and so I found myself by accident in a position where I was able to provide help and provide contacts for people, and that became something that meant a great deal to me. And I didn't want to just walk away from this issue and leave people in need. And so a lot of the motivation for what I've done over the last 20 years has been to try and make sure that there is help for people, that there are ways that people can improve their situation and minimise their exposure and hopefully improve their health.
Great. Well, I often say that if we're waiting for the change to come from above, and by that I'm not talking in a religious perspective, but from the governments and regulatory bodies, sometimes we could be waiting a long time, so the change has to come from the ground up, and you're a great example of that. Let's just go back to some basics here. Wireless radiation, what do we mean by that? Where does it come from?
Well, wireless radiation is the radiation that's emitted from all our wireless devices. So that's our mobile phones and phone towers, NBN towers, inside the home, Wi-Fi networks, tablets, cordless phones, baby monitors and microwave ovens. They all emit this wireless radiation. Sometimes it's called radio frequency radiation, but let's for today just refer to it as wireless radiation.
Right. And we kind of assume that it is safe. If it's out there, it's been tested, right? Shouldn't we assume that's perfectly safe?
Well, you would think so, and you would think that it had been tested before going onto the market, but actually that's not the case. So these wireless technologies have been released onto the market before being tested for health and safety. Now, they do have to comply with the standard, but there's no guarantee that complying with that standard protects health. And so all that research about whether mobile phones are risk for brain tumours, whether Wi-Fi is affecting our bodies and our fertility, all of that is being done now. It's being done after the event, once people are already exposed to the radiation. And that's, in my mind, a big concern.
Yeah. Well, we've had some precedents for it, haven't we? I mean, smoking, asbestos, the after the horse has bolted, it's almost like there are two ways of looking at this. One is to check whether something's safe before you issue it, and the other is to issue it and let us all be part of a big experiment. That's what's happening, obviously.
Very much, and I think particularly for kids, because we've now got kids that are being exposed to this radiation from before birth, and this has never happened in the history of the world before, so we just don't know what exposing pregnant women and their babies for 20, 30, 40 years is going to do, and I think we might get a few surprises down the track.
Now, I know you mentioned this book, Robert Becker, and I'm familiar with it too. The book's all about, what was it called again, the electric body or something?
That was one of his books, and the other was called Cross Currents.
Right. And I think one of the things that I think is important for our listener and all of us to understand is that we, as a human being, are actually walking electricity, are we not?
Oh, that's absolutely right. And I think that's well acknowledged, and it's well known that if you stand in a field, that field is being conducted through your body. So we know that there are fields in the human body, and we know that we can measure these fields too. And scientists do this all the time, because if you think of an electrocardiogram or electroencephalogram, they're all measuring these waves that our heart put out or our brains put out. So we can prove through those sorts of devices that the body is electromagnetic in nature.
And I mean, so is every single cell in our body as it exchanges nutrients across the cell membrane. It's an electrical or osmotic change that happens. So electricity is part of our, it's almost naive to assume that it doesn't have some effect.
Well, that's right, and that was some of the really exciting research that Robert Becker did, because he was able to find out that these fields, these electric fields in the body, actually help the body repair. And he was an orthopaedic surgeon, so he was able to use that information to help knit difficult-to-knit fractures when people had broken limbs and so forth.
The corollary from that might be, hey, maybe this radiation's good for us.
Oh, well, I think that in some frequencies it is, and there are certainly people who are using electromagnetic frequencies to repair the body, but the problem is that there are some frequencies that are not so good for us, and that's the concern. I think some of those frequencies are the ones that we're being exposed to in our everyday wireless environments.
Now we're speaking in Australia here, you and I, we're in Australia, and how do the regulations vary across the world? I mean, there'd be a range of what countries consider safe and what's not. How does that get worked out? Where are we at in Australia, and how do we compare with the rest of the world?
Oh, not very favourably, Ron. Our regulations in Australia are very similar to those of the World Health Organisation and an organisation called ICNIRC, which is part of the World Health Organisation. And they expose people, or they allow the general public and, in fact, workers to be exposed to, let's say, quite high levels of radiation. And it's a little bit complicated to actually describe simply because those levels vary at different frequencies. But certainly there are other countries around the world who've introduced much stricter standards, and Russia was one of those, and Russia's standards have been very much stricter since it did a lot of research on this issue, again going back to around the 1960s. But other countries like India, for example, like France, like Italy, have taken steps to reduce people's exposure to this kind of radiation.
Interesting, isn't it? I mean, I know when I looked at my iPhone, and buried somewhere deep in the instructions is a warning to not put it within 5 millimetres of my body, which was kind of, when I put it to my, having read that after I'd put it to my ear for many, many years, it came as a bit of a surprise. So there's two things, isn't it? One is heat, and the other is the wireless, the actual wireless radiation.
Well, that's right. And there is an assumption that the body is only harmed by radiation if there's a heating effect. But that's not necessarily the case, because there are lots of other ways that the body could experience harm from exposure. So there are a lot of scientists around the world who are looking at those different methods and putting forward different theories about how these fields could affect the body. But I think that you've mentioned an important point when you say that your mobile phone instructs you to keep your phone at a distance from the body. And the interesting thing is that most mobile phones have got those sorts of warnings, and so do things like tablets. And that's because they're not designed to be held right against the body. And if you hold a phone or a tablet against your body while you're using it, you can be exposed to more radiation than the standard allows, even though the standard allows more radiation than some people would say is safe. So that's important for people to know, and unfortunately, not many people are aware of that.
Yeah, so when we look at some of these devices, the phone is one we often, or people will often put to their ear or brain. The laptop, self-explanatory there, isn't it? It sits often in the lap of people, which is quite close to the genitals, the reproductive organs. How are these radiations affecting us? What's the potential harm?
Well, big question there, right? We know that the radiation is having a range of detrimental effects on the body. So it's doing things like damaging our DNA and our chromosomes. It's changing enzymes and the way cells in our body communicate with each other. It's reducing immunity. It's damaging sperm and therefore potentially fertility. It's affecting hormones. It's causing free radical damage in our bodies. It's creating what's called a stress response in the body. It's changing our brainwave patterns. So we know it's doing all of those things, and I don't think there's any argument about that. The argument is, well, how does that impact our health and well-being? And we don't really know the answers to that, but what we do know is that there are quite a lot of studies that are showing a link with mobile phone radiation, for example, and brain tumours. Now, not every study has found that connection, but quite a lot have. And as a result of that research, the radiation was classified as possible, that is a Class 2B carcinogen, by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. So we've now got a fairly major body saying, we think this could be quite a big risk for the body. But also we've got a lot of governments around the world that are starting to say things like, well, we think you should take precautions. And France, for example, has said that Wi-Fi shouldn't be present in childcare centres, and that children under the age of, or I have to check the age, I think it's under the age of 7, shouldn't be using mobile phones. So there is legislation that's cropping up around the world designed to protect people and reduce their exposure. And that's based on the fact that there is quite a body of science that's showing risk.
Now, in case our listener missed this one, did you just say that it is now, the radiation is now being classed as a Class 2 carcinogen?
Yes, that's right, a 2B carcinogen.
2B carcinogen. So carcinogen. So I wanted to repeat that because you kind of slipped that in, and I thought, whoa, that's a big one. Let's not let that one pass over us or wash over us and ignore that one. The radiation, wireless radiation, has been classified as a Class 2B carcinogen.
Yeah, now what that means is that it's a possible carcinogen, and there are quite a few researchers around the world now who've looked at the studies that have come out since that classification and said, well, there's really enough evidence now for it to be classified as a Class 2A carcinogen, which would be a probable carcinogen. So again, we don't know that this radiation is definitely going to cause cancer, but we know that there's a possibility and maybe even a likelihood.
Yeah. Well, given 8 million people die of cancer every year globally, and given I don't think anybody listening to this would not know somebody within 1 degree of separation who hasn't had cancer, and that actually includes myself. So this is a big problem that we are all, from all ages, being exposed to. The other thing you mentioned that I wanted to pick up on is the research is contradictory, and I think this is part of the issues we have in so-called evidence-based medicine, because, of course, if industry were doing their own research, I'm fairly sure that any negative research wouldn't be as widely reported as independent research. Is that a case in this instance? Is there much independent research being done?
Oh, no, there isn't, unfortunately. In fact, there's not a lot of research that's being done in Australia or America or in the Western world at the moment. So a lot of it is coming from places like Greece and Turkey and China. Unfortunately, we should be seeing, given the importance of this issue, we should be seeing a lot more research that's being done on it. But you're right, the research that's being done by industry, and keep in mind that a lot of the research has been funded by industry, does tend to find, surprisingly, that there are no harmful effects. But when you look at the independent research, it's finding that, yes, well, there are effects. And one scientist, Henry Light from the United States, went through the research and he analysed the results of studies according to whether they were done by the telecommunications industry or they were done independently, and he actually saw that split.
Well, I think it would be naive from a commercial perspective to expect anything less. And when we look through healthcare, like the effectiveness of statins, for example, industry research is 20 times more positive than independent research. Antidepressants, 4 times more positive when done by industry than independent. So it's across the board, and that's why I often say it's hard sometimes to distinguish evidence-based medicine from evidence-based marketing. The other interesting one you mentioned is that it's damaging things like DNA, enzymes, chromosomes, hormones, sperm. These are things that don't result in a quick, if you're infected today, tomorrow you'll be sick. That's a quick response. But some of these things, just like in smoking or asbestos, may take years to form. Isn't that, what do you think about that? I mean, how long is the lead time on some of these problems?
Yeah, well, we don't actually know. For some people, there's an immediate reaction. So people I know, for example, or people in our network will react very quickly if they're exposed to wireless radiation, and they develop all sorts of uncomfortable symptoms. And some of those will persist for, a day, a week perhaps. But a lot of people don't react immediately, and so they think, okay, well, I'm not really being affected by this wireless radiation. But a lot of people are developing chronic health problems too. And there seems to be a link between some of those chronic health problems and this sort of exposure. So if you look at things like chronic fatigue, for example, at multiple chemical sensitivity, at fibromyalgia, at lupus, at even post-traumatic stress disorder, they have a link. The biochemistry seems to be pretty related to what's going on in the body of people who are affected by this radiation. So what we think is happening is that there are biochemical changes that are taking place for a variety of reasons, and the symptoms are the same, that people are developing these chronic diseases or chronic conditions, and electromagnetic radiation or wireless radiation could be implicated. So it makes sense for people to reduce their exposure. So when we were talking about cancer a moment ago, Ron, and I just wanted to make the point that people with cancer absorb more radiation than people without cancer. In other words, cancer cells absorb more radiation. So there are a lot of very sensible reasons for reducing exposure.
Wow. Now, hang on. People with cancer absorb more radiation than people without cancer?
Yeah, the cancer cells do, yes.
Wow. Okay, that's a pearl. Thank you. I mean, I've been keeping the phone away from me and the laptops as much as I can, but there's another motivation. Look, you've written this fabulous book, Wireless Wise Families, and I'd love to get you back to talk about the effect of wireless radiation in the family, because that's, all very important. Just very quickly before we finish today, what are some of the things we can do to reduce our exposure?
Well, the number one thing is to use wired connections instead of wireless connections wherever you can. So that might be using a wired phone instead of a cordless phone or a mobile phone. It could be using wired computer or wired internet connections instead of wireless connections. Using a wired laptop, for example, instead of a tablet, because a tablet is really probably no safe way of using that unless it's on airplane mode. So love your wires. That's the first thing. Another thing is for people to keep these devices at a distance from the body. So the further away they are, the better. So you don't want, for example, to be sleeping with your mobile phone turned on next to your bed or even under your pillow, as lots of people do. You don't want to be putting these devices, the tablets or the laptops, on your lap when you're using them, even though they're called laptops. So keep a distance is really important. That means keeping your mobile phone away from you when you're speaking, for example. The other thing is to turn the wireless function off. So turn off your Wi-Fi at night. Turn off your mobile phone when you don't actually need to make a call. Have your tablet on airplane mode as much as you can. So minimise your exposure to this wireless radiation. Those are all things that I think are really important. And I think that it's important for parents to teach their kids to do this, because today's kids don't know any other environment. They don't know about included.
There was a world before wireless, a computer. I don't know what we did in that world, but gee whiz, I still remember it. Look, thank you so much for joining us today, Lyn. The book that you've written, and I want to get you back to talk about the book and its impact on families and preconception, postnatal, school-aged children. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Ron, it's been an absolute pleasure. Lovely talking to you.
So there it is, folks. Quite a lot to think about. I mean, our relationship with technology is challenging enough. Albert Einstein once said that a society controlled by technology is a society of idiots. And, he may not have even imagined, well, maybe he did. I mean, he's a pretty smart guy. He may not have imagined about mobile phones and how buried we are, our heads constantly buried in it. But, this is more about the radiation effects rather than the social and effects on our intellect. I mean, we may not be a society of idiots just yet, although when you see the leader of the free world reduced to 140 characters for some pretty important messaging, you start to wonder. But Lyn left us with 3 guidelines, and like whenever we talk about environmental stresses, being aware of something is really the first step, and she left us with 3 really good pieces of advice. Love your wires, keep your distance, and turn that wireless off. Move stuff away from you. Don't put it near your head or near your groin or your productive organs or any of that. Just keep the wireless radiation as far away from you as you can. Now, there were so many issues that were raised. I wanted to get Lyn back, and I will get her back to talk about some of the problems. Until then, be well. See you next week. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions,